What started as a peaceful protest resulting in a civil war has become a massacre of Syrian civilians involved in attacks by government forces, international coalition forces and the so-called Islamic State. But who has killed more civilians? According to the UN, the crimes against humanity committed by the Assad regime far outnumber those of the so-called Islamic State and other jihadist groups. According to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, a monitoring group based in Britain, between January and July 2015, Assad's military and pro-government militias killed 7,894 people, while the so-called Islamic State killed 1,131. Analysts say the Syrian leader has increasingly relied on his air force, by far his most lethal weapon. As his military suffers huge losses to advancing rebels, the frequency of aerial attacks appears to be increasing. In July 2015, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights documented nearly 7,000 government airstrikes conducted around Syria. According to Amnesty International, government forces carried out attacks that directly targeted civilians, including bombardment of civilian residential and medical facilities with artillery, mortars, barrel bombs and chemical agents, unlawfully killing civilians. Enforced lengthy sieges trapping civilians and depriving them of food, medical care and other necessities. Security forces arbitrarily arrested and continued to detain thousands, including peaceful activists, human rights defenders, media and humanitarian workers, including children. Government forces maintained prolonged sieges of predominantly civilian areas, exposing the residents to starvation and denying them access to medical care and other basic services, while subjecting them to repeated airstrikes, artillery shelling and other attacks. Government forces continue to target health facilities and medical care workers. They repeatedly bombed hospitals and other medical facilities, barred or restricted the inclusion of medical supplies in humanitarian aid deliveries to besieged and hard-to-reach areas, and disrupted or prevented health care provisions in these areas by detaining medical workers and volunteers, killing the vast majority of the 697 medical aid workers killed in Syria between April 2011 and November 2015. Attacks by Russian air forces in ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, the Russian regime has terrorized and massacred the Syrian people and surpassed the extremist group ISIS. Russia intervened in the conflict in support of the Syrian government, beginning a campaign of airstrikes on the 30th of September 2015. ISIS emerged in Syria on the 9th of April 2013, while Russian air forces entered Syria on the 30th of September 2015. 2.5 years after the ISIS, nonetheless, Russian forces have killed more civilians than ISIS according to the most recent report by the SNHR, the Syrian Network for Human Rights. Russia's Red Square is tainted with Syrian blood, which has been published on the 16th of August 2016, and according to the 14 other reports on the violations that have been perpetrated by Russian air forces since its involvement began. Russian air forces have killed no less than 2,704 civilians, including 746 children and 514 women between the 30th of September 2015, the day when Russia entered the Syrian conflict, and the end of July 2016. Among the victims were 28 medics and 10 media activists. All these numbers and statistics are recorded with names, place and date of death, ways of killing and other details. In contrast, ISIS has killed no less than 2,686 civilians, including 368 children and 323 women between the 9th of April 2013, the day when ISIS was established, and the end of July 2016. Among the victims were 34 medics, including 4 female doctors and 11 female nurses, and 57 media activists, including foreign journalists and photographers. The US-led international coalition continued its airstrike against IS and certain other armed groups in northern and eastern Syria, which it had begun in September 2014. Some attacks resulted in civilian casualties. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that 243 civilians were killed in coalition attacks in Syria during the year. On the 30th of April, coalition airstrikes on suspected IS targets reportedly killed 64 civilians. Government and allied forces continue to commit war crimes and other serious violations of international law until this day.